Welcome to Get Wisdom Live with Carl Mollison and Brian Kelly. What if God was also a co-host? What if the historically rare ability to question God directly and get profound answers back has been rediscovered? What would God say to today's sophisticated but deeply troubled world? Get Wisdom Live is here to share those answers with you. Here is Carl Mollison and Brian Kelly. Welcome to another episode of Get Wisdom Live. I'm Brian Kelly, along with Get Wisdom founder and director, Carl Mollison. This week, Creator is going to reveal more mysteries of the ego. We did a show on this a few weeks back, and it was quite fascinating, a lot of the revelations that came forward. But always in trying to reach for more knowledge, Carl, we came up with another set of, I think, interesting questions and even more interesting answers.
I would actually have to agree with you. I always have a little trepidation when your questions come my way and thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be another boring psychological dissection of minutia. But it turns out it's rather important to understand our own makeup, because that's a lot of where inner conflicts come from that drag us down, as well as the interpersonal conflicts that get in the way of normal human relationships, certainly happy ones. And that understanding brings with it wisdom. And we're in the wisdom business, as it turns out.
It does turn out.
So this is going to be a very useful discussion, I think, because you'll hear some fresh perspectives about ego as it relates to a variety of settings and situations and circumstances. And it's a more important aspect of something bigger also, because we can
Agreed.
tell you where it comes from and why, and how it integrates with the rest of us. And there's much more to the story than even science gives credit to, which is typical because they leave out the spiritual dimension altogether.
Yes, you're absolutely right. U.S. Creator, Wikipedia defines the dunning-kruger effect as follows. And Dunning and Kruger were researchers, I believe. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias whereby people with low ability, expertise, or experience regarding a certain type of a task or area of knowledge tend to overestimate their ability or knowledge. This effect seems common and, when encountered, almost completely resistant to challenge or debate. What is Creator's perspective on the Dunning-Kruger effect? How much can be attributed to subconscious programming, and how much to the simple immaturity of the incarnated human?
Okay, well, that's a very complex, convoluted question. But the idea of overestimating, thinking more of yourself, and we were all familiar with that kind of display. So this is what Creator says about this. This is Creator's words from a channeling I did. Human limitations, irregularities, and problematic functioning come from many varied sources. You know them all from probing the need for healing, as well as the human dilemma from being under pressure constantly from the darkness. There are genetic defects common to all human beings you struggle with. That is a kind of corruption that is ancient in its onset, but still keeps humans partly in the dark by inhibiting intuitive sensing. As you know, the intuition is a high form of knowledge and wisdom available to those who are tapped in, despite the faulty physical makeup you have genetically. Some are able to discern more because this plays out in varied degrees, in part as a consequence of a pre-configuration of each individual prior to launch, so to speak, as planned in the light before coming down into the womb to join with the eventual infant that emerges. There are many corruptions through manipulation of all levels of the mind, causing incorporation of faulty thinking, faulty beliefs, and various forms of impairment, discouragement, and disinformation that will keep people off guard, ramp up their anxieties, and may well trigger other festering problems because people can only take so much negativity before the dam breaks, so to speak. That past legacy of prior trauma is a huge factor for every human being because you have been in many lifetimes of struggle and difficulty with many failings and painful times, all of which goes into the backdrop in how you perceive things and react to them. The need to stay on top of things is a life skill, but also a survival instinct. And that indeed is served by the ego as a frontline defender of great importance. So we will be discussing this in much further detail, but like all the other human attributes and functional capabilities, the workings of the ego have their uncertainties. And this is because all the other factors we have laid out here will impinge on the ego every bit as much as any other part of the being and can alter, perturb, or corrupt to make that part of the being less effective, become diminished, or even suppressed to the point where the person is at grave risk. So, the phenomenon you ask about is something that is a coping mechanism that inherently relies on inner assumptions. So, a person can hold their own when confronted, put on the spot, or challenged in some way.
So in this last sentence, Creator is saying point blank that the Dunning-Kruger effect is in fact the ego essentially on full display. I mean, it's the ego fulfilling its purpose of being a coping mechanism and one of great importance, a frontline defender of great importance. Creator says,
Yes, and it's interesting because we tend to notice ego when it's acting up, when it's
right,
sticking out and becoming intrusive or overbearing. We've all had those sort of encounters with someone who is very overconfident and over trustful of their own opinions and instincts, and they want to dominate things.
right.
And of course, we all know people who lack ego strength and suffer as a consequence, and they're likely to become more and more helpless and become a doormat for others who take advantage of them. And that's why defense is an aspect of ego at work and a vital one.
Yeah, it seems to me it would have been a good question to ask maybe for a future show. That the Dunning-Kruger effect is probably really describing people who also can't admit that they're ever wrong, which we all know people like that, right? So that's probably the ego, basically on display as well. So
Yeah.
interesting stuff. US creator, a person with Dunning Kruger might say something like, well, of course I don't know. I don't need to know. I have common sense. And then expects their opinion to carry equal or even greater weight in a given debate. Can creator share just how a person comes to think this way?
All right. And this is what Creator tells us. This kind of thinking is, on its face, very shallow. It might be accurate in some circumstances and be enough to deflect criticism or questioning and enable a person to escape an ongoing contest they want to avoid. And that is the purpose. It is often a kind of habitual default, a go to comment that can cover seemingly many encounters with such strategies, with opposition, counters with opposition, and then out of habit becomes a kind of default response. The danger in such strategies is that the person doing it may well not realize when that is not really sufficient to cover the issue at hand, and where they may have more responsibility to give credence to what someone confronting them is saying, may mishandle the situation and cause a strained relationship, or even a worsening by seeming to ignore serious concerns and a potentially quite valid complaint and justification. This is all a manifestation of an ego defense using an array of strategies to simplify the task of keeping others at bay when challenged. So it is very much akin to carrying not only a spear, but a shield, so one can deflect incoming attacks and stay safe. The fault with having a shallow discernment and appreciation is that by going to a simplistic dismissal, as this represents in some situations, will be seen as unsatisfying and will not truly serve the person using this tactic if they leave a difficult situation unresolved. That can compound things and grow resentment within someone who feels slighted in being dismissed as though they themselves lack common sense. And that should be obvious when their perspective is the opposite. At a minimum, when people are challenged, it will serve them as well as the challenger to think about what is said and at least meet them halfway with a reasoned argument and not just a kind of generality that is dismissive in being so general and presupposing fault in the challenger as well.
I think we see a lot of this on display around Thanksgiving tables, where the family all comes together and you got 30 people there with Uncle Charlie and Aunt Hester, and the politics comes around as part of the conversation. You could see a full flowering of this effect, Carl.
Well, it takes an ego to presume that one knows all and has the true sense of things and feels justified in really kind of washing their hands of the other person in effect.
Yeah.
And that is very hurtful.
Oh,
And
sure.
it drives a wedge between the people.
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, I think we all have some experience with it, at one time or another, for sure. U.S. creator, another behavior related to Dunning-Kruger would be a tendency to appeal to some kind of superior credential, even and especially if it is completely unrelated to the given debate at hand. Such a credential would be physical age. Well, young man, I am 20 years your senior. I think I know a thing or two. Or, you're talking to a decorated veteran. Show some respect. Or, I've lived a good life, had a lucrative career, raised 3 upstanding children, and am a grandparent to boot. I think my opinion should matter. This tendency to take shelter in some kind of superior, if wholly unrelated and even irrelevant credential, is widespread and sometimes very problematic. What is creator's perspective?
All right. And creator says, here you are giving additional examples of platitudes that purport to defend the self through an appeal to rank and privilege in being older, wiser, more capable, more experienced, more productive, and so on, when those attributes and qualifications may not be at all germane to the current dialogue in being challenged in some way. So these are more automatic responses that may well be launched out of habit as a quick solution for self defense, to parry the blow with a retort, as much as shed light on something or engage enough to consider someone's argument and give a thoughtful response about its merits. That would be using those presumed credentials potentially in some way that is actually useful and creates a real life demonstration that they count for something and lead to greater strength, wisdom, discernment, and judgment, as evidenced by the reasoned argument one might make under such a mantle of authority. But to simply puff out a chest of medals when one is confronted in some way about something having nothing to do with participating or leading others in combat is truly beside the point. Even though it may hold a grain of truth that someone tested by fire might deserve being treated with respect, to give them their due about what they've been through and been able to accomplish under difficult circumstances, and so on. But again, showing off one's pedigree is not an answer for disagreements, differences of opinion, and perspectives. Most things of significance are deserving of at least some consideration and a credible answer to provide a reckoning for the disconnection or differing opinions on how to handle a disagreement. It is also clear to most pondering your question that these examples very much do reflect ego strength in action. A prepared, pre planned, pre rehearsed, and habituated talking point meant to override criticism by virtue of prior achievements may or may not, and most likely will not, be even relevant to a current disagreement of some sort, and as such, will be found to be annoying, unsatisfactory, and likely to discredit the one who falls back on a quick rejoinder of this kind to deflect criticism.
So this is an interesting juxtaposition of, of, of outlooks on the ego. Because on the one hand, creator is defending the ego and saying it is a very, very important consciousness artifact that serves a very important purpose, defending the self against onslaught. And yet, the danger of that is becoming too reliant on it. You know, to the point that you end up hiding behind it and letting it do all the presentation. And I guess that's the part of the challenge of being human, Carl.
Well, yes, and there is a danger in not putting in an effort to learn, to grow, to expand, and just fall back on, platitudes, basic assumptions that maybe you can get away with in certain settings, but are not going to be satisfactory or really effective in advancing any kind of a dialogue or relationship. So it's shallow thinking that really we're talking about so far.
Yeah,
And that is a lost opportunity, and it's a kind of intellectual laziness and even a kind of disregard for opposing views. And you see a lot of this in commentary
yeah, yeah,
where people
absolutely.
rely on their politics to explain everything, and that's the answer always.
Yeah,
My party, regardless of what's involved and what the nuances might be, showing us that there's a gap, there's something more needed. And where is that to come from? And it just closes the door on further discussion. So there's a danger
yes,
in the ego taking charge in an ineffective way.
absolutely. You asked Creator. Creator described the ego in a previous Get Wisdom Live program as follows. The ego is a limited vessel, a limited capability that puts the self first. As such, it is kind of like having a suit of armor that is self protective. It might be awkward to wear, inconvenient, even drag you down from the sheer weight and inconvenience of suiting up before you make an excursion where you are at risk, but a potential lifesaver if you are attacked and would otherwise be vulnerable and perish. The suit of armor gives you a fighting chance at least. The ego is the same way, is more like a weapon in being quite focused on your supremacy. In a sense, it is your last refuge to maintain an advantage and hold your ground to stand up to those who would bully you or intimidate and provide a wherewithal to weather the storm. The Dunning-Kruger effect appears to be the ego fulfilling this very function in a crude, imprecise, and very forceful and compelling manner. What is Creator's perspective?
And Creator tells us this is very much the case. You are hitting the nail on the head here in assigning a categorization of this psychological phenomenon as the workings of ego and its role as a self defense strategy and both defensive and offensive capability that could be used by turns or simultaneously to overwhelm an opponent and render them helpless. Like warfare, overpowering someone with words simply because one has the verbal skills and a strong inner wherewithal to make an irrelevant claim of superiority under the cloak of achievement in some other setting is very analogous to a line of warriors standing before an enemy force, puffing out their chests, shouting epithets and curses, and mounting a fierce war cry to show how tough they are and how determined and how powerful they can be. This is no more than bluster until put to the test by being in an actual battle. So it is tactics only, and just as likely to inflame the opposing force to ramp up their doubts, suspicions, and animosity, and trigger an earlier attack than might be done otherwise. It is like taunting someone who is bullying you aggressively by saying, "Bring it on, I'm ready, show me what you've got." That is fighting fire with fire. And as we have said a number of times, doing so is always a bad idea because it leaves out reason, logic, and the blessings of wisdom being factors in determining what might happen next, and possibly save the day from a downward spiral being launched because of negative impulses that have an emotional charge. The ego is there for a reason. It is not an accident of nature or a defect, but a pre-planned part of the makeup of everyone. And if uncorrupted, will be a player many times during their day-to-day life. The key is how the ego is utilized, whether it is allowed to take charge or is constrained and held in reserve so as not to escalate a difficulty unnecessarily. That is part of the art of living, to have a self controlled composure. And of course, this depends on confidence and freedom from fear. Someone who's knocked off balance by a verbal attack might well respond in a knee jerk fashion and become threatening and thereby escalate things and lead to even violence at an extreme. Every person must learn how to rely on their ego and when to keep it in check. This is rarely a situation where the ego is either on or off, in play or inactive. And this is because it is so much a part of your makeup, it will weigh in naturally whenever there is a need for greater personal power, security, or assertiveness to initiate something for personal gain or advantage seen as quite important and an urgent necessity. Indeed, this is why we are having this discussion, because while everyone knows about the ego, they are not taught about the backstory, nor are they coached in how to cope with the darker potential inherent with being human, because this involves moral precepts, ethical principles, and the underlying reality of spiritual origin of your being. And most of those subjects are currently viewed as off limits within the educational system beyond very rudimentary implementation of a system of rewards and punishment to keep youngsters in line and disciplined so they can be managed. That is not contributing to growth, only learning of a sort, teaching them to behave and submit.
Well, I think the thing to really underline here is creator saying that the ego is there for a reason, not an accident of nature or a defect, but a pre-planned part of the makeup of everyone. You know, I have a story about my father. My father had a pretty big ego. But what we're learning here is that an ego that is clearly on display and a bit overactive, you might say, is really trying to protect somebody who feels vulnerable underneath. And that's difficult to see sometimes. But for years I put up with difficult relationship with my father, I would say. And one day I stood up to him and said, "Enough is enough." And finally, he got to a point where he says, "I'm going to hit you." And he clenched his fist and he pulled it back. And I stared him in the eyes and said, "Go ahead." And you know what he did at that exact moment? Burst into tears. I had never seen my father cry almost in my entire life. And to see him suddenly break down into sobbing right at that moment was a watershed for both me and for him. Our relationship actually improved dramatically after that incident, because he was, his shield, his ego was no longer there to protect him for that moment. So, but it does serve a purpose. It's important for people to realize that there's somebody hiding behind that, and they're hiding for a reason, Carl.
Yes, and learning more about how to make your way and navigate these treacherous waters and the things we have to rely on, and even instinctively, it is a big part of life. And it's not done well. And creators alluding to that directly and criticizing the educational system,
Yeah,
very much so, because it is more of a containment mechanism than an upliftment and an expansion of growth in a real sense. So people can grow into their capabilities, and including gaining some more personal power along the way. That could be a loaded, dangerous thing. And if you have to focus on power and control, it squelches the young.
yeah,
And that's not a good thing. It might be tactically necessary in that setting, especially if you can't keep kids interested and engaged.
yeah.
Then you've got to turn to force. But anyway, this is an important topic.
Well, I in my story that I relayed, I was able to penetrate his ego, is how the way I look at it. But that's very difficult to do, and it's hazardous in its own right. It can go either way. It can improve things or make things a lot worse. So you don't necessarily want to blow up somebody's ego to get beyond it. But healing the person that's vulnerable beneath that is really what is necessary in order to help them evolve. And the best way to do the healing, Carl, is the Lightworker healing protocol.
I have to agree, and that's the point of our existence to bring this to the world.
Absolutely. U.S. Creator has previously discussed 5 principal selves that make up the human being: the deep subconscious, subconscious, cellular consciousness, primary or conscious self, and the higher self. What about the ego? Can it be, or should it be, characterized as a 6th self? And if not, why not?
All right, Creator tells us we would say that the ego is a characteristic of a soul attribute that is part of your inherent makeup and serves you in many ways, in many settings, as an aspect of your personality and expression as a physical human being. As such, it is not a separate operating compartment with its own domain separate from other aspects of the mind. It is a soul attribute that can be utilized by multiple levels of the mind in carrying out their duties, even while simply thinking about things and pondering possibilities. This makes sense because you must be human at all levels in order for the mind to serve you as a human being. In that regard, there are many soul attributes being expressed that will contribute to thinking, judgment, and the emotional response to all that is coming into awareness. This is not a passive exercise for which you react later, but must respond on the spot as life unfolds for you. Even with respect to the interior workings of the mind, the ruminations and reflections on the past and future projections, constructed as a kind of fantasy to try them out, in a sense, as a kind of preview, and then react in ways to serve as useful feedback about what might happen given various alternative scenarios. So, for all those functions of the multiple levels of the mind, the ego must be a participant as a resource and a basic component of your makeup as a sentient being of divine origin, with many, many soul attributes in the mix. Similarly, it would be no more appropriate to say that the desire to love and to be loved is a 6th self. It is a soul attribute, and as such can be utilized and acted on and influence in turn anything that might happen at any level of the being, and often needs to be a part of what is under consideration because it is a guiding force. As is true of all soul attributes, they represent a worthwhile potential. There are many such soul attributes in play. This is what makes people quite varied, that the mix of soul attributes will be somewhat different. The problem is when soul attributes are underexpressed or suppressed entirely so as to be, in effect, missing. This will cause an inevitable distortion and malfunction in practical ways and impair a person's progress and effectiveness in their life because all are important, each in their own way, and it is not appropriate to consider them separate selves, let alone beings, as they are component parts, attributes that are variously expressed, both in proportion to others that might compete or conflict even in some way, and so are very important and integral to your makeup in defining who you are as an individual. This is designed to be a quite dynamic, fluid, but highly capable interplay under normal circumstances to happen mostly in an automatic fashion. This is often noted and attributed to instinct, which is a good description of many soul attributes that are a fundamental part of the makeup and will be on display when circumstances call for that to happen and will just happen naturally without conscious planning and implementation. They are, after all, a kind of imperative because they're an energy of consciousness that will have a certain power and influence and act as a kind of special fuel unique to each attribute and what it is designed to support. This all creates a varied and fascinating tapestry in the variety of human beings and what they do in their lives to express the yearnings of the soul.
I really, really appreciate this last paragraph from Creator. And the example that the Creator puts forward, that it's no more appropriate to say that the desire to love and be loved is a sixth self. And this is important, this last paragraph for me, because there's a lot of people out there that think the ego is a problem as opposed to an attribute that has a viable role, and that you shouldn't live without. And so it's good to bring this knowledge forward to help dispel some of these myths about the ego and its place in our consciousness.
Yes, being able to implement the ego effectively and appropriately has got to be a central aspect of a lot of kinds of difficulties. And so that alone is a handle you can work with to help people grow and change for the better. And especially if there's some kind of a corrupting, predisposing alteration of the being that needs healing,
Yeah,
that gets in the way of being in balance, that really begins to focus now on where the problems truly lie. It's the lack of expression or overexpression and imbalance of the various soul attributes, because we do have a full toolkit. We vary in prominence of some over others, and that's what makes us unique as individuals. But everybody's got a fighting chance and
yeah,
has the toolkit to turn to, even if it's somewhat out of character for them. When pushed, they can find the metal to respond effectively if they have to. And
stand
that
their ground. Yeah,
capability might need healing in order to engage with it.
agreed. You ask Creator. Creator has said that angels have egos. It would be assumed then that light beings also have egos of some sort. Is there a difference between the ego of a physical incarnation and the ego of a light being?
Creator says there are many differences that are a function of the differing environments and configurations needed to address needs and express the being in quite different ways, depending on where one is. Keep in mind that as a physical being, you are an extension of your soul, but only a small component part. Given the filters of your imperfect brain and body, you will only be able to connect with the surface representation of the soul attributes you enjoy as a light being, as well as a vastly greater ability to manipulate energy and carry out many seemingly miraculous activities compared to the limitations of the physical realm, where you are bound by gravity and in a fragile form that might be extinguished simply by acts of weather or accident. The ego serves you still because there are many challenges always in existence. Even as a light being, there are constraints and difficulties, chief among them the short leash you will live with, imposed by the law of karma. So, missteps, transgressions, areas of neglect, or manipulation will be very quickly answered with a reckoning of some sort to rein you in and show the error of your thinking. There is still always some latitude, but it is a very reliable system that keeps things humming along. Acts of harm or violence towards others are unthinkable for a light being, for example. This is why heaven is viewed as so very wonderful. It has a deserved reputation as a kind of paradise. The problem for you and others in your galaxy is the potential for free will and its greater freedom, allowing many beings to exceed their authority and get away with it for a time due to the delay built into the law of karma in carrying out its delivery of a wake up call and a reckoning with wrongdoing. All eventually pay for missteps and transgressions, but that delay allows people to at times get away with murder, and it can be seductive and enticing if the ego has too firm a grip and wants feeding. And this leads to serving the self too greatly at the expense of others and even at the expense of the alignment of your being with the soul and its divinity. This, in fact, the ego of the angelics, caused their downfall for Lucifer and the others he was leading. And those fallen angels have plagued beings all throughout the Milky Way galaxy, and of course, reach the Earth and infest humans now as well. This shows quite clearly that the ego is a mixed blessing because strength and power need to be used sparingly and for a high purpose. And if they are used as a weapon to be self serving, will always cause harm as much to the perpetrator as the victim.
So once again, we have creator reasserting that the ego is an important aspect of consciousness for all of consciousness. Creator, not in this show, but in a previous one, said even creator has an ego. You know, so it's not something that we can divorce ourselves from. And this question was brought about because there are people out there that think you lose your ego when you get to heaven. You know, and creator is basically saying not really. That's not necessarily the case. So that's a revelation in its own right, Carl.
Yes, and it's fascinating to consider. And it really puts into better focus that we're in an abnormal environment. And it's an environment that was intended to be a new normal, but got a bit out of control. And
Yeah.
that control is the problem of individual extensions of creator, our individual human makeup. When on our own, if particularly if we're cut off and we don't realize growing up that we're literally a part of the Almighty, and we should know something about spirituality to do it right. And we can easily get misled, off track, lured by others and peer pressures and all those factors, cultural influences. And engaging in wrongdoing can take off. And that's where we are now. We've got to rein that back in and learn how to do it in spite of the difficulty and put the darkness back in the bottle, so to speak,
Yes.
and make spiritual perspectives, the love based view of creator, ascendant once again.
Yeah. And I think it underscores the idea that our ability to work on ourselves is not wasted ever. That any work that we do in reining in our own ego, for instance, is something we're going to take with us to the beyond, to future lives as well. So this idea that we're free of these obstacles once we're gone, I invite people to think of their life in a much bigger context than just this one. You ask
Well,
creator, the ego does not appear to be brain dependent, as lost soul spirits, when encountered by human victims and healers and psychics, seem to display lots of functioning ego characteristics. Can creator comment on the ego's reliance or lack of reliance on the physical brain?
okay. Lost soul spirits with an ego. I know all about that. I've talked to many of them through channeling. I did a whole series of channelings back when the Muslim terrorism was such a big fixture and bombings and killings and beheadings and on and on and on. And I would channel these beings who maybe blew themselves up or blew up other people and got killed.
Mhm.
And I've had them threaten my life.
Oh
I
boy.
mean, that takes some hubris. That
Yeah.
takes some ego. Even tumbling in the darkness, lost, you're ready to fight. This is an ego strength that continues. So this is no assumption. This is based on life experience talking. So,
Oh,
all right, so this is what creator says about the ego's reliance or lack of reliance on the brain. The ego does not depend on the brain other than for a human being to have its thoughts and awareness. This is because the brain does not give rise to consciousness, but simply experiences it as a part of the physical body. This is why your perception as a physical being is that your thoughts reside in your mind, within your head, as a part of the physical you and not coming from outside of you when that is literally the case. Your consciousness resides energetically in another dimension. The brain is only a receiver and display for the conscious signals being sent to it. As your reference point and awareness depends on the workings of the brain, you, in a sense, are living a kind of illusion that you are trapped within this body because everything seems to be about it and within it or depend on it totally when the body and the spirit are separate and distinct energies. And indeed, the conscious self is the tiniest part of your consciousness as a whole because the other levels of the mind are much vaster in reach and capability. And here again, the brain serves simply as a display for the workings of consciousness coming from the varied levels of the mind, each experiencing and sharing information and causing things to happen in their own way, sometimes in collaboration, and sometimes being totally disconnected from one another, as is true of the deep subconscious in particular, that is unknown to and cannot be reached by conscious awareness to even interact at all, as it can do with the upper subconscious mind. There are many reasons for this separation of duties and differing perceptions that can take place, but we can assure you that our plan for you was to have a fully integrated and dynamic interplay to function in a highly effective fashion for your benefit at all times. When that does not happen, it reflects a healing need as well as an opportunity to make things better.
So there's a point of great significance here when Creator is saying that the ego is not dependent on the brain at all, other than having an incarnation, so that you can express yourself in the physical environment. But that really says something because, you know, there's an idea that we have to treat the body because the body is the vehicle that by which consciousness manifests. So our medicines, our therapies, everything that goes into, the research and theorizing about how to treat mental illness, for instance, is overwhelmingly focused on the brain and the chemistry of the brain and the electronics of the brain and the neurotransmissions of the brain and all this. And Creator's saying that that's probably missing the boat here, as far as especially the ego is concerned, Carl.
Yeah, and the implications, as you point out, go far beyond this because the medicine is completely in the dark about consciousness, where it comes from, and I mean, there's many tragic consequences. Being unable to deal with mental illness is one. That's an important one. But the problem of dementia is a growing one with aging of a significant percentage of the population. And people with dementia can't connect to their consciousness. It's a fault of the body, of the brain. That is so. But the person is still in there, tethered to their body, thinking normally, but they can't make their brain work to
Yeah.
talk to you. This is, they're locked in, they're trapped. I mean, this is tragic. It's tragic. And it's because of a lack of understanding of how this all works. So these things we're revealing have many, many implications of great importance and value.
And the really important thing is understanding that if you want to take an approach to heal the problems affecting the mind as opposed to the brain, that it's going to be a modality, it's going to be a protocol, right? That doesn't involve drugs and probably doesn't even involve therapeutic practices such as laying on a couch and free associating what you're thinking, so to speak. Instead, you got to get at the root of the problem. And if that's consciousness, you need a consciousness way of healing that. And that's what the Lightworker Healing Protocol is really all about, Carl.
Yeah, absolutely.
You ask Creator. Oh, but before we move on to the next question, this is the time, if you haven't done it yet, go to getwisdom.com/LHP to download our ebook, getwisdom.com/LHP. And that'll give you a full description of what the Lightworker Healing Protocol is, how to engage a practitioner, as well as how to learn to become a practitioner yourself. So getwisdom.com/LHP. Check it out today. You ask creator, at what age does the ego really take hold in a new incarnation? What can parents and caregivers do to help foster the healthy development of their child's ego?
Creator says parents will likely smile at this answer, having experienced directly the consequences of what we will relate to you about this. The ego is ever present at the outset and continuing lifelong. That again is purposeful planning because infants need some kind of wherewithal on a lifelong basis to stick up for themselves and handle perceived adversity in an effective way that gets results to save them literally from neglect or harm. Acts of crying are often an expression of the ego of an infant reacting to an absence of love by not sending out love to attract more, but complaining about it. That works quite effectively because the maternal instincts of the mother, in particular, will be highly developed and expressed to mount a loving outreach, to bond with a newly arriving infant. And in fact, most of the time during pregnancy as well, looking forward to the new life that will be coming to join the parents as a family. But like all attributes, the ego, as with the ability to love and feel loved, while powerful aspects of the soul can be subjugated and diminished through mistreatment. When infants are traumatized by excessive punishment and criticism, they might suppress their ego out of fear. And that is a kind of damage at some point that will need healing to undo. And if this does not happen, they may become a timid and often helpless adult who cannot hold their own and will likely be bullied and picked on all along the way, treated as a doormat even by loved ones. And there can be many adverse consequences. Not only to have a diminished life of greatly limited opportunity, but adverse health conditions that develop, as well as mental and emotional problems that prevent happiness and drain life of its meaning and potential for growth. So, as we've said, the ego has a prominent role to play. The parents need to help the infant learn moderation and constraint, at least eventually. But even a human infant will respond to love and nurturing. And this will calm things and signal that the ego can stand down for a time because all is well. The life skills needed to reckon with the ego and its power are vitally important for healthy functioning and being a well balanced, normal human being, able to fit in and enjoy the benefits of living with others and gain their love and respect. This is why loving discipline is needed to keep the ego in a better balance through providing outside pressure as an object lesson. To teach the child, they must at times give in and not let their aggressive impulses run wild. Spoiling a child is a great disservice, as some parents come to find out the hard way, but everyone has encountered such children and sees the damage it does to them, as well as those around them. So, this is a vital need and contribution of good parenting to help a child develop in a balanced fashion that will serve them lifelong.
Wow, what a powerful channeling, and it's interesting. I had never thought that a crying infant is really putting their ego on display. That's news. That's interesting stuff, Carl.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it shows how this is integral to life itself and successful survival from the get-go. And even as a light being, we've learned today that we'll have an ego in the light also and beyond in our future destiny to live in a higher dimension if we have an ascension eventually. That's
Sure.
going to require healing first, but if we get there, we'll need our ego to have a wider arena to deal with the rise of evil, even hopefully only in small ways going
Yes.
forward.
Yeah, and especially if the role of the ascended human is to be on an outreach to the rest of the universe to coach them about ways to live effectively, then you'll need an ego continuing to be a shield for yourself, because when you initially start off these negotiations, you're going to be encountering their ego, and it might be quite a bit overwhelming. So yes, it's not something we're going to be able to shed easily, or at all. Actually, we don't want to shed it, I think, at the end of the day. US creator, overinflated egos and the dunning-kruger effect seem to represent pressing healing needs for much of humanity. Can creator share how empowered prayer and the Lightworker healing protocol are the best tools for bringing about the highest and best form of healing?
All right. And Creator describes it as follows. We described at the outset of this discussion the many sources of negativity that influence human beings in development and are a lifelong source of difficulty. They can come and go and reach a crescendo that can overtake, overwhelm, and even cause the early death of a person through a compounding of adversity physically, mentally, or emotionally. Using empowered prayer and the Lightworker healing protocol, our Creator's answer for helping people support themselves and their fellow humans by forming a divine partnership for assistance at those times when inner resources might be exhausted, or people one cares about are suffering but are not in charge of their lives and have little influence directly on things. Requesting a divine intervention on someone's behalf is a divine act in itself and of tremendous value that may well make the difference in saving a life and certainly helping the direction of a lifetime turn to a more positive and productive direction. The vast array of sources of negativity are all encompassed within the Lightworker healing protocol. So it is the best and most powerful tool for changing things for the better by enlisting divine help. Empowered prayer is a great starting point because it can request broad categories of assistance for broad categories of need. It does lack specificity as to causes of adversity that might be underlying a life dilemma and wholly unknown to a person who suffers in any kind of tangible and specific way. This puts a person at a great disadvantage. It is like experiencing pain and not knowing why. If all you can do is cry out by saying, "Make the pain stop," that is specific with request to the complaint, but does not provide any kind of insight or permission for the divine to intercede beyond perhaps a temporary easing of things. This is why prayer has gained such a bad name by many who find the results underwhelming and begin to doubt. That is a downward spiral because to work at all, a prayer requires an absolute belief in the divine to be most effective. Without belief, we cannot intercede on that person's behalf, even if they reach out to us, finally, in desperation, having tried everything else. We might be able to do something, but it will unlikely be a total solution. This is one of the harsh realities of your existence, that the very thing causing all the negativity in the rise of the darkness, representing evil that is all pervasive in your culture, was a consequence of free will and free agency being followed to wretched excess by the fallen angelics and being disconnected from the divine had to begin preying on physical beings to gain energy to keep going because we eventually had to cut them off from receiving life force energy. So you are up against powerful forces. Part of the paradigm of free will demands that you take the initiative because you are in control and in charge, and not us. Being ignorant is a huge disadvantage. Learning about empowered prayer and the Lightworker healing protocol is the antidote for that poison of ignorance, causing you to be a helpless victim of interlopers again and again, and your own disalignment many times in being poorly equipped to handle adversity and not get dragged down and impaired functionally. The Lightworker Healing Protocol is a more powerful way to bring specificity about all these potential sources of difficulty, as well as a sophisticated understanding of how the divine realm can deal with such problems and heal their consequences. That is the second body of knowledge missing in ordinary life experience. And it leaves you greatly disadvantaged because you will not know what to pray for and how to get an effective divine intervention simply on general principles within the rules of engagement that expect you to know what you are doing. That is the challenge, to encourage growth and learning and to take on the problem personally because you were created to solve the problem of evil. And this is part of the exercise. As painful and long term a period of suffering as it has come to be, we can assure you it is that important to have gone through such a trial. If you win, the benefits and the rewards will be much greater and more long lasting than any sacrifice you have had to make, even across hundreds of lifetimes, attempting to advance the cause of the divine and perhaps failing again and again. This is the time when you can finally tip the balance in your favor and triumph. To make it happen, you will need to heal your adversaries who have a hold over you. That is what empowered prayer and the Lightworker Healing Protocol are about, giving you the tools and the built in savvy to be effective in leveraging your power through the divine realm to bring about your deliverance. If you join the cause and use these fine tools, you can do so safely and effectively in the privacy of your own mind and have your intentions join with many others doing the same. And together, we'll reach eventually a quorum that will win the day and allow a grand ascension for the betterment of all. Until that healing is done, your progress as a species is in doubt. It is that simple. It is now or never. There are only a few years left to mount a greater effort, and you are needed. This is your chance to make your life count.
Yes. Chance to make your life count, indeed. The life healing protocol is paramount to the effort to save humanity, to heal the interlopers. But listening to this radio show, Carl, and other radio shows, and well, all the teachings that are accompanied, you know, offered by Get Wisdom, the webinars and the channeling series and all that, those are there to help enhance your understanding and understand the rules of engagement, which Creator said was all important. You really do need to understand the rules of engagement to combine that with your belief quotient, so to speak, to augment it, so that you kind of have an idea of what you're doing and why, because that also enhances your ability to do the Lightworker Healing Protocol effectively.
Well, the rubber does meet the road somewhere. And if you're still in the bleacher seats, if you're still in school, you're not out doing.
Yeah.
And the problem with a lot of the spiritual folk is they're searching for enlightenment as though more knowledge is going to solve everything. That's only a starting point, unfortunately. And you can stay in school for a lifetime if you can afford to do that. But most of us have to go to work for a living and make something happen. And that's how you survive ultimately, or at the work of others if you're well off. And
Yeah.
and so this is the time to act. And
Yes.
we've been shown through these revelations how to act that can make the difference. Finally, after
Yes.
all this time.
Yes, and it's important that you do participate and take action. It's not enough, Carl, to just be a good person and live a good life, is it?
No, No, you'll go down. You'll go by the wayside because they'll mow you down because
And
you're
how many
not
people out there
fighting
think,
back.
yeah, how many people out there think that it is just enough to lead a good life and be a good person? I-
It's a starting point.
It's a starting point. Yeah, absolutely. No, it more is required. And think about it. I mean, if there is a God, then God would certainly have a purpose for us in all of this. And that purpose would be our own participation, our own responsibility, our own maturity, even, right? So, why would God go through all this trouble just to have us, have a good time, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't know about you, Carl.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And as we see around us every day, things can go off the rails. Things can turn dark. And that is the dilemma for which we were actually created because it started before we were even in existence,
Yeah.
this rise of evil in the galaxy. But we're creator's answer for that to take a part of itself, launch it forth as independent beings with some of that creative power and initiative and ego to go and wrestle with the darkness and overcome it through finding how to go about it in a loving way. Not another war,
No.
but a love wave that has a purpose and has the knowledge and power of understanding to be effective.
Yes. We're
And
looking.
this is what we're offering with these healing tools,
We're not
a
looking for a
bridge
nuclear train
between
wreck.
you and the divine for a partnership that brings that full power of the divine to bear. It doesn't
Absolutely.
get any better than that.
We're looking for a love-based chain reaction, not a nuclear one, right, Carl?
Yep.
All right, that's all we have for this week's Get Wisdom. Be sure to download the Lightwork Healing Protocol ebook, getwisdom.com/LHP, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Be well.